In the previous unit or the previous video, we had talked about the 1950s and the changing American culture of the 1950s. This is a continuation of that. Now we need to look at the 1960s. We started with the civil rights movement. We started with some of the economic changes. Now we need to look at Kennedy and some of his changes that he's going to make from the Eisenhower years. So Eisenhower was a Republican. He had that dynamic conservatism, something like that, where he kept the framework of the New Deal, but didn't want to expand it. He actually shrank it down a little bit. Nixon and Kennedy have an election about what to do with that. And Kennedy is going to get elected promising a new frontier. And by new frontier, he just meant these new dynamic changes. And he's going to re-expand or attempt to re-expand some of the New Deal stuff. And there's going to be a lot of other conflicts during his presidency. Now, this is a very close election. It's the first televised election. You can see here, young, charismatic, good-looking John Kennedy defeats the older, sweatier, kind of paler-looking Richard Nixon. It's a very close election. Some people blame this for allowing the better-looking Kennedy to get an advantage. Some people say that the civil rights movement helped Kennedy because Kennedy supported Martin Luther King Jr. right before the election, which pulled a lot of black votes his way. So one way or the other, this is going to become a theme of his presidency, and that's the issues dealing with the civil rights movement. Now, Kennedy, does try to create this new expansive building back out of the New Deal, and he called it the New Frontier. And he has some successes, but not a whole lot, because a lot of the programs that he wanted to get put in place were blocked by Congress. There's something called a filibuster in Congress, where the Senate needs to have 60 votes in order to pass certain legislations. The filibuster is a way to stall legislation. So in the modern era, this becomes even more utilized. We'll talk about that later. Some of the few successes that Kennedy does have in this New Frontier program is called the Housing Act, right? They saw the problems of white flight. They saw the problem of urban crumbling infrastructure. They tried to fix some of that through this Housing Act. He tries to improve the United States' understanding and standing among third world countries by creating the Peace Corps. This is where young men and women of the United States, instead of maybe joining the military, they would join the Peace Corps, and they'd go and help some of these underdeveloped nations with developing. And he does look at now the fact that women have the right to vote and women are becoming more active, especially following World War II. We're going to see the 1950s is that time of the baby boom and women go back into their traditional gender roles. But in the 1960s, women are starting to become more aggressive and more active in the feminist movement. The Equal Pay Act was a way to try to even out gender pay gap. Probably most important for us here is the space race. Remember, Sputnik made a lot of Americans very nervous that the Americans were falling behind. And the space race is going to impact a lot of things. Kennedy here promised to put a man on the moon by 1970. The United States gets there in 1969. This was a response to Soviet manned flight, in response to space flight, and in response to Americans feeling like they'd fallen behind. We have the National Education Defense Act. We have efforts to improve math and science. All of that is fed in through the space race. Now, the thing that I think is most interesting, though, is civil rights. And that is this politically and socially dangerous moment for Kennedy, because presidents want to get reelected. And he knows that if he makes any stance on civil rights, then that's going to impact the ability of him to get Southern Democrat votes, right? Because Kennedy is a Democrat, and he needs those Southern Democrats to vote for him. And the white Southern Democrats, which we talked about already, that were resisting, say, the integration of the military, they called themselves Dixiecrats. Well, they could turn on the party, and they know that. And they use that to try to push back against civil rights. Now, eventually, Kennedy is going to be forced into action on civil rights by activists and the violent white backlash to those activists. But he initially doesn't really want to do much at all. We'll talk about some of those backlashes here. Another backlash for Kennedy, and you can see this cigar blowing up in his face. That's an old joke. It's supposed to mean that he was embarrassed. And this is a Cuban cigar. You can see that on the label there. Kennedy faced a big catastrophe in Cuba. During the Eisenhower administration, about 4 years earlier, Castro had overthrown the Cuban leader, Batista, who was supported by the United States. The United States was always looking for a way to get Cuba back under its thumb. And when Kennedy took office, there was a plan in place to storm Cuba through the Bay of Pigs. That's just the name of the body of water, the Bay of Pigs. In this Bay of Pigs invasion, the United States trained a bunch of Cuban exiles who had fled Cuba when Castro took over. The CIA trained them, gave them weapons, gave them boats, and they were expected to go back to Cuba and try to overthrow Castro. Castro and the communists knew they were coming, though, and they were waiting for them, captured them on the beach. Some were executed, most were imprisoned. This is a pretty big embarrassment for John F. Kennedy, although in some perverse way, it showed that he was trying to fight communism, which helped out the Democrats to make him look less weak on communism. So Castro also becomes more paranoid, and with his paranoia, Castro is going to try to find a friend, and he finds that friend in the Soviet Union. This is also the era under the Kennedy administration where the Soviets build the Berlin Wall. This here is the city of Berlin, which is surrounded by East Germany. East Berlin here is a Soviet occupation, but West Berlin on this side, that was operated and controlled by the United States and Britain. So this is capitalist democracy within a sea of Soviet communism. And we already talked about the Berlin airlift, and we talked about the Berlin blockade. But after the 1961 Vienna conference, the new Soviet premier Khrushchev, who was replacing the paranoid Stalin, thought that he was going to walk all over John F. Kennedy. And in response to the poor showing that Kennedy had at Vienna, he sends more troops into West Berlin. And Khrushchev uses this as an excuse to build a wall. You see the wall here, right? Uses it an excuse to build a wall between East and West Berlin and surrounds the other side of Berlin with a wall, essentially enclosing West Berlin. Now, he's not worried about an attack from West Berlin. In fact, he's more worried about these people in East Berlin escaping to freedom and capitalism and democracy in West Berlin. So the wall is there attentively to keep the U.S. from invading, but in reality, it's a way to stop communists from leaving communism, because if they left communism, it would show that they didn't really like it, and that ruins their whole worldview. This becomes a symbol for the Cold War, right? Symbolically, the wall represents the Iron Curtain, and as long as that wall stands, the war is going on. This Berlin Wall also reheats the arms race, and now nuclear weapons are going to be starting to be built rather than just conventional weapons. And that leads us into the Cuban Missile Crisis. I told you, Castro was looking for a friend, and that friend he found was the Soviet Union. And not only did they start trading with each other, they also convinced the Soviets convinced the Cubans to put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. That way they could never be threatened by the United States. Now, the problem for that is that a nuclear missile on Cuba could hit anywhere in the United States, and that terrifies the U.S. So they were flying airplanes over Cuba to see, just to monitor, and they see these nuclear weapons being built, and the United States lays a blockade around the island of Cuba. They send the Navy down, and they surround the island of Cuba with warships, and that means if the Soviets try to get into Cuba, they're going to run into American warships. Those warships are going to fight, and if those warships fight, that could lead to nuclear war because of mutually assured destruction policy. This turns into a 13-day standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States. And with that 13-day standoff, because of the blockade of the Soviets, the world was never sure if it was going to blow up that night or not. So you can see Kennedy here, right? Kennedy is arm wrestling Khrushchev, the Soviet premier. But when you look at the cartoon, it doesn't really matter who hits the button because they're both going to die. Now, they knew that, and that leads to this. You have Kennedy and Khrushchev working together to keep the nuclear monster inside the box. Now, in the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, after 13 days, the Soviet Union backs down. There was actually a secret negotiation where the United States agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, which is about the same distance from the Soviet Union as Cuba is from the United States. but that's not out in the public. What it looks like is the Soviet Union backs down, nuclear war is avoided, which everybody's happy about. But again, just increases the tensions there. This is also the era where the United States gets involved in Vietnam. We've already talked about this. Eisenhower stepped in when the French left Indochina, which is now called Vietnam. The United States does not want Vietnam to become a communist country. So the United States steps in, supports South Vietnam, which was tentatively a democratic state. The United States under Kennedy sends military advisors, weapons, and money to support South Vietnam because of this domino theory, which suggested that if Vietnam falls to communism, then all of Asia, then all of Canada, and eventually the United States. So got to stop it there. We'll pick up more with the civil rights stuff later, but that's the 1960s Kennedy kind of foreign policy stuff.